Okay, so welcome everyone to this taster session on the Abbey Theatre. The Abbey Theatre is, of course, Ireland's national theatre, and while it's famous for its drama, it's also famous, if you like, for the drama which it created over the last really close on 120 years. It's Ireland's national theatre, but it's also been the place where a lot of very controversial things have happened, where a lot of great plays have been staged, where a lot of great actors have cut their teeth, and it's really been at the centre of a lot of different cultural debates. A lot of the most controversial plays in Irish culture have been there. So what this course will do is really it examines a lot of, or in chronological order, some of the really key iconic Abbey texts. What makes them Abbey plays? What makes them so controversial? Can we trace a lineage between them, where one writer passes on another passes on some of their art to the next artist? But also, what sort of Ireland does it reflect each time? How does each artist respond to the Ireland of their time? So here are some of, on the left is Marina Carr's By the Bog of Cats, a play about Hester Swain, who is a sort of a scorned woman. It definitely kind of was quite controversial, quite new at the time, and because of its first insight really onto the stage of traveller culture. On the right hand side, we have Plough the Stars, which is the first sort of staunchly anti-nationalist play by Sean O'Casey. And all of these things, all of these sort of tremendous dramas, these tremendously controversial cultural things happened on the Abbey stage, which is really why the Abbey has the reputation that it has as this place full of stormy controversies. Because really, what a culture should do is look at itself, and the Abbey provided a way to do that. And it wasn't always popular, but it very often was very controversial, and things became critically acclaimed in retrospect. So the opening night was in December 1904, and this is the old site of the Abbey Theatre, before its demise, and it's being rebuilt. But here's what it looked like inside. So as you can see, it's quite a traditional theatre. It looks quite like the Olympia. It really has some kind of resonances with, like places like the Royal Court in Britain. It was really an attempt to build Ireland's own grand theatre, a place where Irish theatrical tradition could take place. It was quite ornate, quite English in its in its sensibilities in terms of its architecture as well. So this is what it looked like inside. This is a reconstruction of Before the Fire. But so this is where these plays would have taken place. So the Abbey, for the purpose of the first half of the course that we're dealing with, is this younger this younger Abbey, which is actually probably slightly smaller as well. It would have been slightly more intimate than the Abbey that we know now. But where did it come from? Who were its parents? So these are the founders of the Abbey Theatre, and the people who breathed life into it for the first time. So the most famous one is, of course, William Butler Yeats, who's primarily known as a poet. He was also a dramatist as well. His plays were not necessarily as popular as his poems, but nonetheless, he was one of the founding members of the Abbey Theatre. He, along with others, had a vision of what Irish theatre should be. They wanted to create this space for drama and art that was Irish to take place. They didn't want to be imitators anymore of other kinds of art. They wanted an Irish drama for an Irish people, and that's where it would happen. It would happen on the Abbey stage. So Yeats was one of the I guess, kind of cultural forces behind setting up the Abbey Theatre. It was part of his vision. But another member of this team was Lady Augusta Gregory, who has really come to light more so over the last 20 or 30 years. But she was instrumental, not just in terms of being a friend and confidant and a supporter of Yeats, but as a collector of folklore in her own right. She was very involved in the collection of folklore, especially from the late 19th century onwards. She collected a lot of, and wrote down a lot of Irish folk stories, and they appear in the Abbey Theatre plays. as well. She makes them part of the work. She's very interested in the particularities of Irish culture, the things that that survive colonization, if you like, the native tales. So she was another person who was very invested in bringing this theatre to life, and she did so along with Yeats. The third most famous figure who gave rise to the inception of the theatre itself, and probably the youngest, was John Millington Synge. And Synge was certainly one of the earliest controversies in the Abbey, for sure. Synge was Anglo-Irish, as Lady Gregory and William Butler Yeats were, but he also had a very keen interest in the Irish language. He studied Irish and Hebrew, and in fact, he went to the Aran Islands to learn Irish and or to perfect his Irish, but also he made these linguistic charts. He really wanted of what people were saying. He really wanted to capture a pure Irish essence in his language, and he really injected that into the work. So as you can see, these three are Anglo-Irish. They're outside the norms of Irish identity, and at the same time, they really have a desire to belong to it, to capture its essence and to put it on the stage. And Synge really did that as well, alongside Yeats and Lady Gregory. But where did the money come from is a pretty reasonable question. Well, it actually came from an English heiress, Anne Horniman, who was sort of, she was involved in theatre herself, and she was the person really who put up the money for this. She's kind of generally seemingly kind of forgotten about, I think, in history, but she was the person who bankrolled the whole thing. So without her, we pretty much wouldn't have an Abbey theatre. Dublin didn't really have the money to spend in 1904 on a theatre. So then that's where it came from. That's what its vision was, and that's where its financing came from. So who were the playwrights? Well, over the 20th and 21st century, we've had some really key influential playwrights in Ireland, but not just in Ireland. These are our world famous playwrights, which is quite a feat for a small theatre, which was sort of, I guess, humble in its beginnings, but became really world renowned. These are playwrights whose work is studied the world over, not just as examples of Irish drama, but also as examples of real innovation in drama generally. These people are from a small island. They come from a small theatre usually, but then it becomes so influential all over the world. These plays are read, especially in America. They're read in Brazil. They're read in Spain. Actually, there's a big Irish studies cohort in Brazil. So on the top left, we have Frank McGuinness, who's very involved in the Abbey. Plays like Carthaginians and Observe the Sons of Ulster Marching Toward the Somme have played there. Lady Gregory, of course, her early plays really dealt with Irish folklore and the native Irish tradition. And then on Lady Gregory's right, Tom Murphy, rather. The Geely concert is arguably his, I guess, best play. Whistle in the Dark is his other one as well. 1983, a real leading light in Irish drama. Then on the bottom left, Marina Carr, whose plays have been very visceral, very controversial, very difficult, really, in terms of dealing with them. She doesn't shy away from I guess the brutal elements of society. So her plays on Raftery's Hill and By the Bog of Cats are plays which deal with things that society wants to forget about, and these are the things that it's most difficult to look at on the stage. To the right of her, then, Sean O'Casey. Sean O'Casey is really the Abbey's most famous playwright from the 20s and 30s. He really helped shift the Abbey from this place which was there to bolster nationalism into a place which is really very critical of nationalism and really very critical of the dogma that underlied it, especially in post-independence Ireland. There was this sense of Ireland was in this state of malaise and ennui, and O'Casey was really somebody who held a mirror up to this Ireland which had been, as he felt, let down by the project of sacrifice leading to independence. And then beside him, of course, the recently departed Brian Friel. Brian Friel, who's actually Northern Irish, really kind of dealt very strongly with the sense of place, identity, and memory. So his plays, Translations, Dancing at Lunasa, they all deal with this element of Irish culture kind of struggling against the colonial, colonial forces, really. So these are just some of the names who have really made an impact the world over, in not just in Irish theatre, but really all over the world. So there, it's Playwrights. Who were its actors? Well, there are many very famous Abbey playwrights, and many famous Abbey actors. But I want to look at some in particular as examples of actors who moved from that small stage and onto the big screen in America. For example, Sarah Allgood, whose sister Molly was also in the first production of Playboy, The Western World. She was one of the first Abbey actors. So as you can see here on the left, in Riders to the Sea, she looks sort of very, very somber, very solemn. It's a very kind of Abbey picture. So here she is in that first production. But then later, you may have also seen her in Jane Eyre, where she has that same kind of very stark aspect that the Abbey was famous for. Jane Eyre is of course a very Gothic text, but an especially Gothic film. It's full of shadows. So she really seemed to make it from the stage to the cinema. And she was also in How Green Was My Valley, with the famous Welsh film. So she really, the Abbey seemed to be this signifier of excellence, which carried her. Well, she carried herself, but of course, it's interesting that her training in the Abbey was such that it lent to the big screen. Of course, Siobhan McKenna, I should say, who was one of the earlier Abbey actors, and again, much like in Sarah Allgood's picture, we have this very sort of hypnotized, solemn expression on her face. But you've also probably seen her in the right on Dr. Zhivago, and you've seen her in Mary, Mother of Jesus too. So her training in the Abbey definitely sort of, was part of her migration to the big screen. But other actors trained in the Abbey School, which survived much longer. So Colin Meaney is an example of one of those actors. Really carries with him an intensity in a lot of roles, which I would say probably came from his training in the Abbey, dealing with those Abbey plays. So there he is in, of course, Star Trek and the Snapper, or the van rather, on the right. Also, Stephen Ray. His brooding intensity, I would say, was definitely honed during his training in the Abbey. So on the bottom left, that's him in The Crying Game as well. Stephen Ray's made too many films to mention, but he did start as well on the Abbey stage and made it to the big screen. So the Abbey's prowess really lasted about 47 years until, I'm sure some of you know, it was destroyed by a fire during a production, actually, or a revival of Plough on the Stars. So that's where it met its demise, and it was rehoused to the Queen's for about 15 years. But it did rise from the ashes, and here's where the Abbey is now. But the question is, if it burned down, why bother to preserve it? Why bother to rebuild it? Which, of course, the state did at considerable expense. So why do we need a national theatre? Well, there are a few reasons why we need a national theatre and why the government have always sort of kept this theatre alive. First of all, there's the Irish proverb, Tír gan teanga, tír gan ainm. A country without a language is a country without a soul. And I think that's applicable to the idea of a drama. You need your own national theatre to have your own expression, your own place to express creatively, your own place to make your own art about your own country, rather than necessarily staging plays from other countries, your own drama for your own people. An Irish theatre, then, for Irish art, we have our own culture to draw on. We don't need to only put on plays by Chekhov and Ibsen and Shakespeare. We can put those on too, but we need to express ourselves as we are and hold a mirror up to our culture and sponsor our own artists, give them a place to be creative, but also a place to perform this physically on the stage. Colonial countries also need their own spaces, or post-colonial countries, at this time it was colonial, need their own spaces to express cultural resistance. So, in other words, a lot is done through theatre. Theatre provides this space to write back against the colonizer, to critique the place that they have left behind, and to champion the downtrodden colonial victim. It's also involved in writing back against the colonizer, or the stage Irishman. You've probably all encountered the stage Irishman before. The stage Irishman is a sort of a very two-dimensional figure, and they usually show up for comic relief. They're not especially important. They're not three-dimensional. They're not well developed. They're just there for comedy. And that's how Irish people have been depicted on the stage for a long time. And the Abbey was partially founded to really fight back against this and show that Ireland was a more complex place of deeper emotion and deeper artistic sensibility than it had been depicted. Also, it was a place for nationalist sentiment and ideas. It was the heart and consciousness of Ireland and Irish art being played out on the stage. A place for us to reflect ourselves. What was Ireland really like? Some playwrights wanted to show Ireland as it should be, or could be. And some playwrights were more interested in showing Ireland as it was. That was really the difference between Yeats, people like Yeats and Lady Gregory, and people like O'Casey. There was that sense of wishful thinking about Yeats, a real sense of romance and imagination. But O'Casey refused that romanticism, or as he felt, that kind of flattery, and showed the casualties, if you like, of nationalist sentiment. But again, these were places where that the Abbey allowed to play out. But it also stakes itself, as I mentioned earlier, against its colonial counterpart. If you look at the Abbey Theatre, you look inside, it doesn't look unlike the Royal Court Theatre. England has its own theatrical tradition, its own drama. Where do they have it? They put it on their theatres. Well, we'll do that too, and we'll do it better, and we'll do it for ourselves. The Abbey was part of this kind of writing back. We need our own place for our own art. So again, it's interesting that it seems to even partially base itself on the British theatre, even in its architecture. But all of this is very important context. But the Abbey was born out of a really vital cultural movement in Ireland, and it was called the Irish Revival. The Irish Revival really was this resurgent interest in Irish culture in the late 19th century. We felt things had been forgotten, they had been left to die. We were going to bring them back and realize who we were as people. So, what the Irish Revival was a resurgence in interest in Irish culture from about 1890 to 1920. Ireland became, if you like, Irish culture became appreciable, became appreciated, became a subject of curiosity. It even became fashionable. It became a sort of a middle-class endeavour. If anybody knows Joyce's The Dead, Miss Ivors is the character who really appreciates Irish culture. She really likes the sense of identity that it helps to give her. So it becomes kind of studied as well. It gets popular. It becomes very credible and intellectual as well. So it leads to people doing things to revive this culture. It was reviving dormant practices that mark us as a people in our own right, things that separate us from our previous colonizers. And we performed those things. So it's brought about, it was involved in bringing about spaces to cultivate and perform Irishness. Not just books about Irishness, but rather spaces to perform and bring Irishness back through performance. So where did it come from? Well, there are a few factors that really led to the revival taking off with the fervor that it did. So first of all, there was the decline of Irish as a spoken language throughout the 1800s. This is for a few reasons. Partially because Irish was associated with sort of, the idea of being a peasant or sort of a backwards kind of language. So when the colonizer manages to get across to the colonized that their customs are sort of, unevolved and uncivilized, of course, the colonizer takes over as the person who you should emulate. So this means that the Irish language really became very deflated. People didn't want to learn anymore. They wanted to learn English because it was associated with education, being upper class. So it really, or upper middle class, I should say. So it really died a lot in the 1800s. And by the early 1890s, it had declined very, very seriously. So there was a sense of loss about that. We've lost a part of our identity. We've lost something which makes us separate from other countries. And it was this sort of realization that led to this resurgence, an attempt to revive it. Ireland had also become increasingly anglicised. The Acts of Union, for example, in 1800, brought Ireland completely and formally under the control of the Crown, which meant that it was the Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. So with that sense comes a sense of, okay, now we've really lost ourselves because we're under someone else's control. And again, leads to the sense of loss, a sense of something has died, or to use the revival terms, something is asleep within us and needs to be woken up. This is the idea of the Celtic note, the thing that binds us all together, that we have to reawaken in order to fully realize ourselves. There's a huge sense of ambition about the revival, a huge sense of possibility and romance. This is what we could make Ireland if we all tried, if we really all wanted it. This is the possibility of what we could do. There was also a lot of material to draw on. So there were various uprisings, including the United Irishmen, Robert Emmet, all sorts of uprisings that resulted in heroes being made. And these were the heroes that the Abbey would draw on in plays like Cathy na Houlihan. They would draw on the noble blood sacrifice, not because that it was definitely going to sort of get rid of the colonizer or the British Empire, but rather the romance that it would inspire, the art that it would inspire. The idea of sacrificing the self for some greater good is the ultimate image of romantic heroism, and that's really what makes it into the Abbey plays. Also, the famine was one thing that really incurred quite a lot of anti-English sentiment from the 1850s onwards. And when you incur anti-English sentiment, of course, there is a revival of one's own culture, because one's own culture is the thing that makes it different to the colonizer. And while there is, while there are a lot of strands of Irishness that were revived, there was a particular interest in Celtic folklore, mysticism, and storytelling. It was a very Anglo-Irish thing to become very interested in folklore and mysticism. It was a really thing to be collected. And these things were collected and written down and, of course, made their way into the Abbey. So there were some major organizations which were established. So the first one is the Gaelic League, or Cunra na Gaeilge. And this was really a place where all of these elements of culture could be practiced. There was dance, there was music, there was recitations, there was singing, and there was poetry. It really was... I mean, even if you look at the word league, it was something which was set up for everyone to come together, and it was very, very well attended. It became very fashionable. It was something that you didn't really want to miss out on. It really gained quite a lot of momentum. There was, of course, the GAA as well. The GAA, which Gaelic Athletic Association, which was set up in Thurles in 1884, was a part of reviving the idea, especially of Irish masculinity. These were the sports and games which made us different from the colonizer with their games of football and cricket and rugby. We had our own games, but not only did we have our own games, they were faster, they were more difficult, they required more prowess, they were more masculine. You had to be like a cuchulainn on the pitch. All of these various counties and tribes played off against each other to find whose team had the best army. So this was another place to perform Irishness, but especially a masculine Irishness. And then the Abbey Theatre fits in here somewhere in the middle, because it is physical, it is performing. It's performing Irish plays for Irish people, but it's doing it really with respect to culture. But this is where culture becomes embodied. These people play parts, they play characters. This is, I guess, where the cultural consciousness of a culture plays out on the stage. So the Abbey was very much part of this revival. So the Abbey is established, but then what did it want to do? What were its aims? We know its ostensible aims, but what did people like Lady Gregory and Edward Martin and Synge, what did they want to set out about themselves? Well, they had a manifesto. They had a document which is about sort of 5 or 6 pages long, which sets out specifically in very kind of bold terms. Lady Gregory said later that she felt it was a little bit pompous. But I think the way in which it's written and the ambition and the fervor and the romance of it is really, really something remarkable, because it was that really carried it through and really made it to be a continuing success. So she says in 1904 that we propose to have performed in Dublin in the spring of every year certain Celtic and Irish plays, which, whatever be their degree of excellence, will be written with a high ambition, and so to build up a Celtic and Irish school of dramatic literature. I think it's really worth unpacking that statement. Certain Celtic and Irish plays. So this is not just any theatre. This is not a theatre that's going to put on Ibsen and Chekhov and, like Uncle Vanya and things like that. This is just for Irish plays. Why do you want to do that? Because you want to put Ireland on the stage. You want to get rid of other sort of foreign influences. And if it sounds a bit jingoistic, then, well, it probably was. It was trying to cut through colonialism, which, whatever be the degree of excellence, will be written with high ambition. So this is nearly an admission that they don't need to be good necessarily, as I'm sure not all plays were submitted were, but they were written with high ambition. Ambition was the important thing. Romance, the fact that you were building something, that you were aspiring, you were contributing through imagination and drive and vision. And so build up a Celtic and Irish school of dramatic literature. If anybody knows the end of Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, Stephen talks about forging in the smithy of his soul, the uncreated conscience of my race. Forging is an important word there, because it means to create, but also to falsify. So Lady Gregory here is talking about building up a Celtic and Irish school of dramatic literature. It's nearly an acknowledgement that we don't really have Celtic and Irish school of dramatic literature yet, but we'll build one. We have the material, we have the culture. Here is where we're going to do it. And that's why the Abbey plays tell us so much about not just Ireland's culture, but also about its wish of who it wanted to be at the time. And that's one of the big debates in the Abbey Theatre, is who are we versus who do we want to be? And then the Abbey changes. It gets very experimental. It starts to change form. It starts to deal with monologue plays. It eventually, after a long time of having male-dominated playwrights, has an increasing amount of women, especially involved in the Waking the Feminist movement about 7 or 8 years ago. So the Abbey Manifesto is what it starts out as, but yet it's really important to examine the changes that occur throughout. So she goes on with some more kind of hope and ambition and aspiration and romance. We hope to find in Ireland an uncorrupted and imaginative audience, trained to listen by its passion for oratory, and believe that our desire to bring upon the stage the deeper thoughts and emotions of Ireland will ensure for us a tolerant welcome, and that freedom to experiment which is not found in the theatres of England. So, there's a few things to unpack here. In other words, she's saying here, Ireland is not England. Ireland's different to England. In Ireland, there's a kind of a sort of a wishful thinking, kind of a romance about that, something that unites us all. So there's really quite a lot of blinding ambition and romance going on here, and imagination. Ireland has an uncorrupted and imaginative audience, trained to listen by its passion for oratory. So she's kind of saying to the Irish people, I know that you're all fascinating storytellers, and like you're all very engaged in culture. This is where we're going to put it on the stage. and believed that our desire to bring upon the stage the deeper thoughts and emotions of Ireland. So Ireland has deeper thoughts and emotions. There are things to tap into as a culture which haven't yet been tapped into. And this is the project of the Abbey as part of the revival. And also that freedom to experiment, which isn't found in the theatres of England. So here we have Ireland staking itself against England. There's a kind of a writing back to England. Our theatre is better than yours. This is part of the ambition and the fact that it comes out of this being annoyed with English theatre, because she says that we will show that Ireland is not the home of buffoonery and easy sentiment, as it has been portrayed, but the home of an ancient idealism. The home of buffoonery and easy sentiment. So this has been the dominant mode of representation of Irish people for a long time, as the stereotype. So what this abstracts down to is the stage Irishman. The stage Irishman, this is from Punch magazine, now, of course, very famous as colonial representations of Ireland. So why does the empire depict the natives as sort of ape-like, slightly inhuman figures? Well, it makes them easier to colonize, because they're not quite human. They need to be civilized, and also gives them somebody to look down on to reinforce their own kind of nobility. So the stage Irishman had this buffoonery and easy sentiment. They were sort of idiots on the stage. They were there for comic relief. And their easy sentiment was that they would sort of burst into song. They're often quite emotional, nearly childlike. They couldn't really restrain their emotions. So they were really quite two-dimensional. And this is what Lady Gregory and Yeats and Synge really tried to write back against. They said, we're not being portrayed by somebody else. We're going to portray ourselves in the theatre. And one of the most egregious offenders of this is Dion Boucicault's The Chocron, which is set in Ireland. But it's a comedy. It's kind of a farce play. And it really sort of plays into all those Irish stereotypes. There's a lot of drinking, a lot of singing, a lot of keening. It's not serious drama, really. And though, it's not really that the founders of the Abbey are saying that we're not going to do any comedies, but rather we're not going to be the subject of just laughs anymore, just sort of cheap laughs. So the Chocron was definitely among the worst offenders there, but it was very popular. But perhaps most worryingly for Lady Gregory and Yeats and Synge, it was very popular in Ireland. They felt that Ireland was selling itself out by not really representing itself properly and seriously. That's why Synge draws on Irish folk legends and folklore and fairy tales, but also injects elements of Shakespeare into the work. So he sort of seeks to ennoble the Irish peasant. He says the Irish peasantry is worthy of Shakespeare. They're not just sort of gone-being characters. They're not just sort of, if you like, Killing a Scully characters, but rather they are worthy of serious intellectual drama. And that's what they put out there, and that's what they wanted people to want. Now, we don't have to look too far to see this reputation, or rather this approach play out. RTE in the 1950s and 60s and 70s did something very similar in that they wanted to show the Irish people what they thought they should want. So there were a lot of things that propped up Irish culture. The Abbey did the same thing. The only difference, really, or one of the main differences, I should say, between the Abbey and RTE was that RTE rarely, until I guess, Tommy Tiernan's appearance on the Late Late Show in the late 1990s, rarely incurred as much controversy as the Abbey. The Abbey seems to be marked by constant controversy, from its inception to its plays about nationalism, to its plays really, or rather the controversy surrounding the fact in, I guess, 2013 or 2014, that people seem to realize, of course it was obvious, but seemed to realize collectively, that Ireland, or the Abbey, didn't really have very many female playwrights, only a handful. So it seems it tries to rectify that then later on. So it's again a new movement in the Abbey Theatre. So it's always been the subject of a lot of controversy. But controversy, of course, tells us a lot about ourselves as a culture. That which we object to tells us or informs us very clearly about our values as a culture. So if you want to reflect a culture, you have to be careful, or perhaps you don't really have to be careful. Reflecting the Irish people, especially at that time in the height of the revival, when Yeats's poetry had become very popular, it was very romantic, it was very flattering. There was a sense in which Ireland was regaining its agency, its masculinity. It was saying, we're not, we're not gombeans, and we're not sort of two-dimensional characters. We're good Irish, here's the thing, good Irish Catholics, as we have been for a long time. Now, why Catholicism? Why did that take on so much? Well, because Britain, for a long time, well, since Henry VIII, had been a Protestant country. So one of the key things differentiated Britain and Ireland was religion, was Catholicism. So that was something that was very much adhered to as part of it. And of course, we know from 1922 onwards that the place of Catholicism in Ireland became reinforced because it was a major point of differentiation between the colonizer and Ireland. If we were going to forge our identity, we were going to forge it against Britain. So the idea of the virtuous Irish people was very much at the core of really what people wanted to see. And as I'm sure some of you, maybe even all of you, may know, the Playboy, the Western world, did not reflect Irish people as they wanted to be reflected at all. In this way, it has something in common with Joyce's Dubliners, which couldn't find a publisher in Ireland because it was, I guess, dirty. It dealt with kind of sleaze and alcohol and all those unpleasant things. It didn't reflect Ireland well. The Abbey, however, as it did a lot, sometimes still continues to do, took the risk and put it on the stage. Playboy, the Western World, which is something that we'll cover, especially from the point of view of controversy. Playboy, the Western World was a play, it continues to be performed quite a lot since 1907, so it's 114 years old now. It's a play set in the west of Ireland, in a small town, and it's very much a town in decay. It's kind of backwards. There's no imagination, there's no romance. The men are all kind of lazy and ineffectual, kind of partially where Sean Casey gets his characters as well in Juno and the Paycock. But this is a very ineffectual place, a place of no romance in the west of Ireland. But then, so it's set in a shebeen in the west of Ireland. There's not much romance, however, about it. Christy Mahan shows up. The Christy Mahan meaning, or Mahan meaning, man, but he's also the son of Mahan, the son of man. He's kind of Christ-like. So Christy Mahan shows up claiming to have killed his father with a blow of a loy, and he suddenly becomes a playboy, hence the title. He becomes revered and the subject of fascination in Ireland. He becomes a hero because he's actually done something. He's done something to strike back against the idea of mundanity. So he becomes famous. So the people in the town basically make him their king. And then, of course, he has a downfall when the father actually shows up. There's a couple of things that are important about this. Some people have read the fact that Christie's being raised up immediately and then dropped when the truth is discovered is analogous to Parnell, to John Stuart Parnell's, or Charles Stuart Parnell's downfall from office after his affair with Catherine O'Shea was found out. Actually, the play uses the word shift, which had been used in relation to Catherine O'Shea. By the way, her name was Catherine, not Kitty as it's being said, but rather Catherine. Kitty was slang for a prostitute. So one of the things that this play did, it wasn't so much the fact that there was a murder on the stage, because of course there are murders in countless Shakespeare plays, but it was the murder of an Irish father by his supposedly good Irish Catholic son. People really, really objected to this play, not because of the murder, but because of how it portrayed particularly young Irish men and women. Christie becomes a playboy. All of the women in the town flock to see him. They completely fawn over him because he's dared commit the ultimate act. People really couldn't believe this. In fact, they rioted. As the play progressed and it became clear that Christie didn't seem to have any remorse for this, but rather was a hero, and the townspeople worshipped him, there was sort of unsettling in the seats. There was some kind of tutting. There was some sort of awkward shifting around. And this sort of coalesced or gained momentum into people shouting. And then the whole theatre started to rebel, started to shout. Now, this caused serious problems. Before the days of microphones, this meant that the actors had to continue. Now, they carried it on in silence, which is very telling. The Abbey seemed to keep playing. But people were screaming up the stage, "This is not us. This is not Ireland." It seems then that the ambition of the Abbey to experiment ran counter to what the Abbey Theatre was supposed to do, which is which was supposed to present Ireland as it could and should be. So Synge was the first rebel in Irish drama. He was the first person to really challenge the notion of Irishness from within the theatre. So the play continued, I think in about the second half, but the characters couldn't be heard, but they kept going. There was screaming from the stalls. Now, I should say as well that Yeats was there on that night, and he came out on the stage to sort of remonstrate with the audience. I don't think they could really hear him, but he basically accused them of having no imagination and ambition, and this young man is a genius. But the play nonetheless persisted, kept going, and it kept being revived. The Abbey really, stuck by its guns. There was someone else there that night, actually. A young James Joyce was there 3 years after he'd finished Dubliners, but couldn't find a publisher for it. He went to see Synge's Playboy, The Western World, and he wrote an essay about it called The Day of the Rabblement, which talks about there's a new force in Irish culture and Irish theatre. We've got to pay attention to this. And that's actually a text that we look at toward the beginning of the course. So really, the play hit a nerve because Irish people felt, no, this is what we value. We value our purity and our virtuousness and the fact that we have good sons and fathers and daughters, and especially our women are pure as well. So here's how we examine drama, but also we examine a culture's values by examining the drama and its reaction and about why it was so controversial. That's one of the great things about studying the Abbey's drama. And Yeats kind of testifies to this when he says that whenever a country produces a man of genius, that man is never like the country's idea of itself. So really, what he's saying here is that the job or the task of the artist is to be honest, is to hold a mirror up to an Ireland or up to any country and not be tempted to flatter that country for what it sees itself as. You think about all of the great artists, most of them do that. Yeats certainly moved away from that in his middle years in the 1910s and 1920s. Of course, Joyce was always completely against that. So holding a mirror up to a country is flawed. And in fact, there is a scene in Play of the Western World where Christie does hold a mirror up to himself and smiles. So we really do examine a lot of these individual moments in the plays as examples of Ireland really reflecting itself. But we also examine the stagecraft of it and how the play works in and of itself, how the play functions, what kind of play is it. So we kind of examine those aspects as well. So what then happens is each student develops their own relationship with the plays, with the drama, and then learns or hones their skills of reading drama generally. We also talk about the evolution of the theatre itself and what was going on in the theatre at the time. So it's kind of a holistic perspective. But to go back to Playboy, there were two very different reactions to this. So Arthur Griffith, who would become the leader of Sinn Féin, called this a vile and inhuman play. So in other words, it was very much letting the side down. He felt this was in very poor taste. It was against nation building. Lady Gregory, though, was different. She was in the wings when the Playboy riot happened. And she said to the actors, keep playing, keep playing. These are the two really different forces at play in the early Abbey. The Abbey moves from romance to showing Ireland as it is, and then a more complex form of theatre. And it is this constant evolution which reflects a changing Ireland that we really examine. So then, what does the course examine? Well, the first week, we read two very short plays. Kathleen Nahulan by Yeats and Lee Gregory, and The Rising of the Moon. And both of these plays really deal with Irish folklore, a sense of imagination about Ireland, a sense of native wisdom prevailing over the colonizer. Then we move on to, I guess, the first real innovator, John Millington saying, Riders to the Sea, a play which is unusual for the time because there's only one male speaking part in it. It's all about the relationship between the women on the stage and how they deal with death, the presence of folklore in the play, and also the fact that Ireland seems to be, according to Synge's perception, seems to be in this sort of backward state of decline. Then also The Well of the Saints, which deals with Ireland's resistance to Catholicism, which is kind of, I guess, is part of the revival because it does mark Ireland as different, but nonetheless it did run counter to Catholicism. Then after that we examine in detail a vile and inhuman play, Playboy, the Western World. There are, I'm sure, clips of this available online, so it is a good idea to get a sense of it if you can on video. If you've seen it before online, that's enough. So you don't need to read it again. You can just talk about it. I'll bring the text in and project it as well. Also, I should say the majority of these, especially from week 1 to 4, these are available for free online because they're out of copyright. So you don't actually need to buy anything. We then move on to Brian Friel's Faith Healer as part of a new form of apolitical drama dealing in the 5th province. So that's kind of his masterpiece. Sorry, I just have to make sure that this is plugged in. We then move on to another masterpiece, Tom Murphy's The Julie Concert from 1984. So these are quite close together, and we do look at an overall chronology of the work. So we go from the early stage of the Abbey to 20 years later. How has O'Casey changed from Synge and Yeats? So we kind of examine this lineage. We then move on to this new form of theatre, which is supposed to be apolitical. And then we move on to Tom Murphy's Staging Therapy, a play which doesn't really deal as much with Irishness, but rather the way in which memory and identity and trauma are intertwined as well. We then move on to two female playwrights, Marina Carr's By the Bog of Cats, which deals with the notion of traveller identity and traveller marginalisation. And it's actually a retelling in some ways of the Greek myth of Medea, with a traveller woman who, of course, I guess, now, but especially then, would have been very much marginalized in society. So it's from her perspective. So we deal with that. How does Marina Carr treat, especially during the time of the Celtic Tiger, people who were left behind? So the idea here is that as a woman scorned, she actually becomes powerful and abject. It's a very gripping play. I should say as well, the Faith Healer, for anybody who hasn't come across it, it's actually a monologue play. It's 3 conflicting monologues, Aidan Gillen has played it recently as well. Ray Fiennes has played it. It's a very prized, coveted role. So that's actually a series of monologues. One, two. I don't want to say too much in case I spoil it, but they're from 3 different characters, and then the first character again. I think it's made a few lists of the top 100 greatest plays of all time, quite high up there. And then we finish with Elaine Murphy's Shush, which kind of calls back to Sing because it deals with female relationships, especially in a post-crash context. So these latter 4, I don't think they're available online yet because they're out of print, but I'll see if they can be provided. If any of you have seen the plays already and just want to come and talk about them in the class, that's fine too. I won't be testing anyone to see if they've done their homework. So the way the classes work is that ideally you read or watch the text in advance. I gave a lecture for about sort of 15-20 minutes, and then I've got some discussion points, and really it's kind of over to you then. Like, what I want to do is to get everyone who wants to discuss important aspects, the things that struck them about the play, and then we build up an understanding of the play collectively. We relate it to Ireland, we relate it to the previous plays, we relate it to Irish cultural debates. We talk about, other texts it may remind you of. And we also kind of tease out really important moments in the play. So you kind of learn as well how to interpret and read drama for yourself, which is really very much a skill that you can either create or hone or start for the first time. I don't presume any existing knowledge of any of these texts at all. It's very much a beginner's, well, not beginners only necessarily, but there's no sort of prerequisite for this at all, and everyone's contributions are warmly welcomed. Although if people feel like they're more comfortable in sort of observing, taking notes that they want to, you're welcome to do that too. So it begins on February 1st as well, and there are still some places online, I think. So that's pretty much a rundown of the course, what it's about, and the tumult of the Abbey. So the booking link has just been made available.